Our final speaker today is Dr. Luis Martínez-Fernández. Dr. Martínez-Fernández is a professor of history at UCF. He received his PhD in Latin American history from Duke University, and his research interests are Latin America, Caribbean, Cuba and Puerto Rico, Latinos in the United States, and higher education. As far as his publications, I'll say it this way. I forget the number of books he's published. Whenever you forget the number of books someone's published, that means they published many books. I'll just highlight, there are at least 5, maybe more. In 2014, he published Revolutionary Cuba, a history, which earned the honorable mention from the International Latino Book Awards in 2015. And today he's going to talk about his newest publication. Let's just say this too. Dr. Martínez-Fernández is one of the senior scholars of our department. And by senior, I don't mean that he's old. I'm not saying you're old. I'm saying he's been a scholar for a long time. So what you might find by listening to what he's saying is his insights are a little different than some you've heard before. But what he's going to talk about today is his newest book, He Did the New World, The History of Early Colonial Cuba. Dr. Martínez-Fernández.
Thank you, Dan, for those kind words. I also want to thank Tiffany, who's out there, who I saw bringing some bags of food, and she's kept an eye so that everything goes perfectly. I'm going to start with a quote. It's a quote from a professor. It's not really a quote, but let me get there. So there's this professor who's at a cocktail party, and he's talking to somebody about himself. The other person had a lot of patience, but then he says, well, enough about me. Let me tell you about my book. So that's what I'm going to do today, and I'm going to throw in other things as well. I'm going to be very honest with you. I am delighted to see this gathering. This is countercultural, you know? Not just in the world in general, but within the universities. I remember when the humanities were at the heart of any major important university. And I think a lot about that, and I think about metrics. So I see we're counting my books. So, but how do you measure the impact of this kind of gathering, which I am very sure, just like it did for me many, many years ago, you get some seeds planted in your brain about books, about projects, about doing things, about methods that may give fruit 20 years from now. How do you measure that? How do you put that in a glossy annual report? You can't do it. And now that I said that, I'm going to say that I am saying that because the experience of writing this book has a lot to do with that. Professors, dedicated professors that I had at the University of Puerto Rico, at Duke University, who were medievalists. I was trained under, one of them was a medievalist who became a historian of the Caribbean. But these were colonialists, and I learned so much from them, but I strayed and I worked on the 19th century and contemporary Puerto Rico, which some could argue that because Puerto Rico is still a colony, if you study contemporary Puerto Rico, you're a colonialist. In any event, I had those seeds planted in my brain about the importance of the origins of early colonial Cuba. I was also interested, David, in filling some gaps, and one of them, well, I'll tell you what happened. This book is supposed to come out many years ago. But what happened was that I had an encounter with somebody in Las Vegas, of all places, in a rather seedy hotel, because that's where the Latin American Studies Association decided to have us stay. And I remember, you know, that metal furniture, you know, very strange, by the swimming pool. It was like a mafia meeting, I guess. And I told Lou Perez, I'm very excited because I'm going to write a book about early colonial Cuba. And Lou Perez is the dean of Cuban studies in this country. And he said, Luis, why do you do that? Nobody cares about early colonial Cuba. And he said, why don't you write a book about the Cuban Revolution? Which people care about. And I was going to stick with my plan, but a few months later, he invited me to collaborate with a reader about the Cuban Revolution, and I wrote a chapter that was, it turned out to be very long, and I said, well, I have 75 pages. I might as well add a little bit and have a book. Bad idea, because of course, I needed to write a comprehensive history of the Cuban Revolution, which, by the way, nobody had written a history book that was comprehensive about the Cuban Revolution. Because what's out there are readers and volumes, edited volumes. So I did that. I don't know whether it was a blessing or a curse, but when you write about the Cuban Revolution, you're going to alienate almost everybody to your right, your left. You alienate yourself. And then I decided I'm going to get as far as I can from that. So I'm going to start working with this book that starts with, actually, I was going to say that it starts with the indigenous, but for this book, I had to research tectonic plate movements and formations of soil and things that I wasn't that interested in. And I wrote this book. I never left the classroom, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so happy to see you here. I started in school. My mom put me in school when I was 3.5 years old in Lima, Peru. It was a Catholic school. If we get a chance to talk someday, I can explain why my mom decided to put me in school when I was 3.5 years old. It was a good decision. But I fell in love with school. And I still have to this day my atlas, my 3rd grade atlas that I bought for my schoolwork. Now, all of the countries have changed, okay? So it's not useful in that regard. But then I fell in love with the University of Puerto Rico, and it was ideas. It was ideas that captivated me. And I had wonderful professors. And they are all here in one way or another. The 2 colonialist professors that I had, John Topasky from Duke, Aida Caro Costas from the University of Puerto Rico, my professor, my dear professor, Fernando Picó, a Jesuit priest who had enough patience to deal with his Protestant disciple. And he told us a few things that I think are still good advice. He said, Luis, take risks. Luis, dare to surprise people. And another one that was related, keep your own voice. And I'm sharing that advice because, you know, being a historian is not a valley of roses. You know, everybody has an uncle or a grandfather that out of love says, what are you doing studying history? And it's out of love. So now that we take that step to be countercultural, then we might as well take it all the way, right? And do what we think is right and not just be blown by waves of historiography that come and go. I want this book to be special. And one of the things that I learned when I wrote the book about the Cuban Revolution was, I know I'm going to take a lot of flack, therefore, everything has to be as perfect as it can in order to protect the book. Well, that didn't keep some critics from saying very strange things. Some of your colleagues in England, my goodness, they were very harsh with me. I mean, he even mentioned my father, who was an anti-Castro activist that I wrote, because you can reply. He said, you know, you must know things that I don't know, because I lived with my father 40 plus years and I never heard of that. So what is this book about? This book is a synthesis. And I like to write synthetic books, which doesn't sound very good. I like to write books that are synthesis, because I think that there's too much, and that was one of the things that I rebelled against when I was a graduate student. It was all about microhistory. And my classmates were writing little projects about Puerto Rico's already micro to begin with, but they were writing projects about the merchants in this little town, or the purchase and sale of slaves in that other little town. And I really didn't have much of patience for that. And I always went for the larger ideas, which, by the way, it's not a great recommendation for students who are writing their first, the dissertation on the first book. I got away with it, and I wrote about Cuba and Puerto Rico, which was a comparative study. One of the things that I tried to do in this book, sometimes I've shared in class with my students a cartoon from the Chronicle of Higher Education that I just love, and it's making fun of historians, and we sort of deserved it many times. And this is the cartoon, if you can visualize it. There's a historian with a camera. Well, there's somebody with a camera, and it's looking at a very fuzzy scenario. It's not clear. It's like Jackson Pollock painting. It's not very clear. And then the historian is tinkering with the antennas. And televisions back then used to have antennas. And he's tinkering with that so that he gets a picture that is perfect, and you see some human beings represented, but the reality is very fuzzy. And that's one of the things that we try to do. We try to make something very clear out of things that are very fuzzy and complicated. And I try to do that in this book. It wasn't easy. So I had 3 tracks. Number 1, I wanted to make sure that it was a book about the Atlantic, the broader context, macro level. That was number 1. Number 2, because it was about Cuba, that I would focus on certain locales in Cuba. Havana was one of them. Some sugar plantations were others. And then 3, something that I insist so much that we need more. We need histories about real people who had first names and last names, and who cried, and who fell in love, and who got sick. But we don't write history like that. We write about people as if they're robots. And what I'm going to do, I don't know how much time I have left. Maybe 2 minutes? 2 minutes? 2 minutes? Well, what I did was I selected a number of characters that I interjected into this narrative. And I'll share you just a couple of them. Let's see. Okay, this is one of my favorite characters. This is in Cuba, 1580. Captain Melchor Sardo de Arana arrived in Havana to take charge as alcalde of the Castillo de la Real Fortification. The fort, which had just been finished, housed a 50-man garrison. Sardo de Arana moved into the fort with his wife and mother-in-law, an arrangement that irritated Captain General Gabriel de Luján. Captain General also complained about Sardo de Arana's behavior, accusing him of neglecting his responsibilities, of engaging against the law in lucrative commercial ventures. And the protocolo records, which are the Spanish history is so fascinating because Spaniards were so bureaucratic and everything had to be notarized and triplicate, and there's a lot to find. So in these protocolos, they document these sales of imported goods, most likely contraband, to local merchants. According to witnesses who testified against them on one occasion, at the house of a fellow officer, he dressed up in a petticoat and a turban and performed a sketch in which he mimicked a street prostitute. His behavior in public also earned him censure. Reportedly, he was wearing a negligee when buying meat at the market. During his juicio de residencia, that's a post-tenure review, Sardo de Arana, we don't want that here, other tenures. During his juicio de residencia, Sardo de Arana was accused of behaving like a, quote, low person who had compromised the dignity of his office by, among other things, buying a fried plantain, the staple of the Afro-Cuban diet, from a woman street vendor, an African-derived practice. He ate it right then and there, continued the accusation, and he burned his tongue. The implicit accusation was that he had ceased to be a Spaniard and had become something else. He had become aplatanado, which the best translation is he became banana-like. as generations of Creolized Spaniards would continue to be for centuries. One more. In 1976, as thousands of Cuban soldiers, most of them descendants of slaves, were fighting in Angola on the side of the MPLA, Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, renowned Cuban historian Manuel Moreno Fraginals published a short piece entitled Manuel de Angola in the national newspaper Granma, the only one, I should add. In it, he described how Manuel, whose African name is unknown, was baptized in a collective ceremony, most likely soon after he arrived in Cuba. Baltasar Gonzalez, a priest, officiated the ceremony on October 7, 1685. In preparation for the baptism, the priest anointed Manuel with consecrated oil. An Ararat couple from Dahomey, Andres and Francisca, stood as godparents. Moreno Fraginals, the historian, wrote that Manuel, quote, was from over there, and 3 centuries later is from here. Meaning, thank you, meaning that he had always been both African and Cuban. And these are the people that are really interesting. I mean, we still haven't gotten beyond, the focus on the great man of history. We still do that for some reason, but I like to have fun with my research, and I encourage you to always have fun with your research and writing.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We still have a few minutes, so if you have any questions, please ask. Just raise your hand, and we'll let you ask whatever you want to.
So Dr. Gannon, in your book, you were talking about the Civil War. So it sounds like there was a popular perception. When you're uncovering facts that go against that popular perception, how did that influence your work, how you wrote it, the point you wanted to make? I mean, if I have the wrong impression of history, how difficult is it, or how much of a challenge is it to get me to change my point of view?
Well, I mean, one of the things I spent a lot of time actually, and one of my main points in the book is a lot of the things that transmitted our popular culture, movies and TV and visiting battlefields. So I spent a lot of time on that. But I think the really most subversive thing in the book, and that's pretty darn subversive, is that I say historians were part and parcel of this misperception. So I studied what historians said and then wrote in textbooks, which are really the most ignored key to memory, about the Civil War. It was historians who would write things about how benign slavery was and how abolitionists were troublemakers, and not just Southern historians. It was historians who wrote that the war wasn't about slavery, that it was about something else. I mean, probably the most subversive thing in that book is I'm saying, look, we're part and parcel of it. It's not just people, there was a basis for what people believed, and historians were part of it. And one of the great issues is, particularly when historians became very professionalized at the end of the 19th century, a lot of them really went off the rails about the war and what it was about for their own reasons. So yes, popular perceptions are rooted in historical work.
Good questions.
I have a question for Dr. Head.
Yes.
So you mentioned that one of the reasons that you wrote the book or you edited the book was because it wasn't useful to you in class, or it wasn't as useful as something more recent would have been. So I guess my question is, when you were choosing the essayists and when you were editing their work, how much of that focus was on what would be useful to your class, or like what you would want to teach? Do you think that affected like how you edited the works?
So at the editing stage, not so much. I mean, there is really making sure there's clarity that, as well written as it could be, is accessible and all that kind of thing. More so, how it affected my teaching, where my interest in my teaching, what I wanted to be useful, that came in the conceptualization of the book. So, for example, this is about Caribbean piracy, mostly in the 17th and 18th century. You can easily do the global history. The previous volume that I was by competitor, whose title I will not mention. There's a chapter. That book had chapters on Chinese piracy, on Mediterranean piracy, and ancient piracy. And when I teach the class, I don't want to do that. I want to do the pirates of the Caribbean. Also, another focus that I had that I could never find anything in scholarship really that was very good that would bear on this question that students always want to talk about was the popular culture part of this, right? How is it that pirates become so popular? And one of the things I wondered, so I made sure that I try to get several essays on that topic, broadly conceived. So yes, at the conceptualization level, I think it's fairly selfish in the sense that I wanted something that at least I could use in the way that I wanted to teach the course. So at that level, it's where it mostly came out. Thanks for asking.
David, you were very helpful with my work because one of the chapters deals with piracy, and you kindly read it. Ezekiel also read, because I was writing about African religions, and our dear friend Simon Barton also read a chapter. And he read it when he was very busy, and he was in Spain, and he had made the commitment, and I know he didn't have the time, but he sent it to me, and I was able to benefit from his help. So what we do is largely collaborative in one way or another.
Good questions. Good questions. Okay, well, in a sense, that's a good thing, because now we have a little time. If you would like to speak to any of these authors, please do. And I hope what you're getting from this today is historical scholarship at UCF is very vibrant, it's very diverse, and it's related to today's modern issues. So please talk to them, get their insights, and then you go out and do the exact same thing. Thank you all for being here today.